Richard Holbrooke, who was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs in the Carter administration, was closely involved in the arrangements under which Aquino was able to come to the United States for heart surgery in 1980. Mr. Holbrooke had extensive dealings with the Marcos regime during his tenure. He is with us now from Chicago. Mr. Holbrooke, in 1980, Aquino was in jail. He was under a death sentence. Why did Marcos let him go?
Marcos was under great pressure, Sam, from the United States government to do something about Aquino. We did not think the charges against him were serious, and we certainly didn't view him as a communist. I thought that he was, and remained until his death 2 days ago, the most important moderate opposition leader in the Philippines, and indeed one of the most important political leaders in all of East Asia. Marcos's doctors visited Aquino in jail early in 1980 and found that he had a heart condition which would require an open heart surgery. The Marcoses did not want to risk having that surgery take place in Manila, so rather rapidly they put him on a plane and sent him off to Baylor, where he had a successful open heart surgery. He was supposed to return to the Philippines under the original agreement rather shortly thereafter, but I think everyone understood when he got on that plane for the United States that he was going to rally himself, rest, talk to other opposition leaders, and decide what to do next.
Mr. Holbrooke, why did Marcos call him a communist? Was it because Marcos really thought he might be, or was it the convenient label that Marcos knew would just upset a lot of people in the United States?
I really don't know the answer to that question, Sam. I asked President Marcos and Mrs. Marcos several times their views on Aquino. They were characterized by extreme personal bitterness, particularly on the part of Mrs. Marcos. Curiously, I think that Aquino and Marcos had a certain wary respect for each other, even though they recognized that they were mortal enemies and adversaries in a certain sense. You know, they were fraternity brothers, and Aquino told me once that Marcos came one day unexpectedly to the prison and spent about 3 hours talking to him, and they gave each other the secret fraternity handshake. They talked in terms of fraternity brothers, although 15 years difference in age, and then they resumed their kind of deadly combat over the leadership of the Philippines.
Now, what kind of a leader is Marcos? Is he a dictator? Is he a tyrant?
Marcos is, first of all, a genuinely skillful, indeed often brilliant politician who was in his early phases a man of immense promise for the future of the Philippines. He has done some good things for the Philippines, but in destroying the orderly transitional structures of government in the Philippines, by extending his rule now in a very personal way for 18 years, and by creating some aspects of a dynasty, particularly with Mrs. Marcos, whom, as I'm sure you know, is the most controversial figure in the Philippines, he has created long-term problems for himself. That is why, as your last report so accurately pointed out, State Department officials, not only in the Carter years, but even in the Reagan administration, have been worried about the Philippines. But I don't think it was until the tragedy of 2 days ago that you had the potential, and I stress the word potential because nobody knows what's going to happen now.
Now, just hold it right there, because I want to explore that with you, and we will. We'll be back in just a moment when we continue our discussion with Richard Holbrooke. Later, we'll talk with the former Philippine foreign minister who opposes the government of President Marcos. Will you explore that? Do you actually think that President Marcos could be toppled because of the assassination?
Sam, I didn't quite say that. What I said was that there has been a clear potential instability in the Philippines for some time. The question which I'm sure all my former colleagues in the State Department and other diplomats around the world and a lot of Filipinos must be asking themselves tonight is whether or not this tragic event is the beginning of the unraveling. You know, in other governments, in other countries, in Vietnam 20 years ago with the Buddhist uprisings, in Iran a few years ago, there was a spark that set things off and they began to deteriorate. I don't know whether this event is the spark or not. I hope not. I think it would be a tragedy if the Philippines deteriorated into bloodshed and anarchy.
Well, now
but the thing is, Sam, that we cannot stress too strongly that the most important and distinguished leader of moderate opposition in the Philippines has been killed in the most brutal and inexplicable way. And it is impossible for anyone to foresee the consequences of that act tonight.
Well, that leads to my next question, which is, who killed him? And I know that you and all of the other people who study the Philippines in and out of our government are asking themselves that question. Have you come up with some hypotheses?
Well, I know nothing more than the reporting which Jim Lowry and his colleagues have done from Manila. But it does seem to me that, first of all, Marcos is going to have a very difficult time explaining the circumstances of this. Whatever the reports that come out, a lot of people aren't going to fully believe them. And at a minimum, the totally inadequate security at the airport, which Mrs. Aquino so eloquently discussed with you earlier, is inexplicable and inexcusable. I don't want to sound overly melodramatic, but it does seem to me that a sort of a cloud, a stain, if you will, now hangs over the government, and in a way that has not happened before.
Well, of course, President Marcos in a news conference made that same point. He suggested that his enemies, the communists for one, might have killed Aquino just to do what you have described, put a cloud over his head. Is that realistic?
You know, it's a pretty long-shot theory, but even if it's true, Sam, how in God's name, in that country where security can be very effective, as those of us who've traveled with senior American officials have seen, how in God's name could a man get off an airplane and be killed before he could even reach the bottom of the ramp? It is a bizarre and inexplicable event, and at a minimum, it requires the most extensive explanation.
Mr. Holbrooke, why should the United States do business with Ferdinand Marcos? Amnesty International says he tortured, he killed, he caused to disappear many Filipinos, not just during martial law, but they charge even after martial law was lifted. So why shouldn't the United States say enough?
Sam, you raise now the most difficult question, the United States stake in the Philippines. Here is a country, our only former colony in the world, a country in which we have our two largest overseas bases of immense importance to our strategic position, not only in East Asia and the Western Pacific, but stretching all the way across the Indian Ocean into the Middle East. We need the Philippines, and the Philippines needs us. I want to stress to you, as I said repeatedly when I was Assistant Secretary of State, that our bases in the Philippines, our base agreement with Marcos, which has just been renewed by the Reagan administration in an agreement which I think is a good agreement and in the national interest, is not a support of an individual man or an individual regime. It is a continuation of almost a century of close relations between our two countries. And it would be inconceivable to me that we could sustain the kind of setback in the Philippines that we have suffered in Iran in the last few years without a catastrophic end result for America's national interest throughout the world.
Do I take it then that you believe President Reagan should go ahead with his planned November visit to Manila?
Well, you know, relations between the United States and the Philippines do not need to have the excessively warm embrace which was characterized, for example, by Vice President Bush's performance in Manila in 1981. He went to Manila and just overdid it. He began the process of a kind of a personalized identification, which I think was unnecessary. I don't know whether President Reagan ought to go at this time or not. That's a decision only he can make. But I think that we have to stress to the people of the Philippines, to the people of Asia, to the American people, that we and the Philippine people have ties which cannot be broken because they're in both our interests. And we have to move away from this concept that the American bases are somehow supporting a particular man or a particular regime. That's a nonsensical position, although it's one which has been put forward quite often by opposition leaders in recent months. It's just wrong. The bases are there not to support Marcos, but to defend America's national interests.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Holbrooke, for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Sam.